Hello and welcome. It has been quite a while since I've done a build guide, but going into this character, I knew that I wanted something that I could share with and recommend to other players. So with that in mind, I needed to make sure that it functioned on around 20 exalts. Now, I originally made the character about 2.5 weeks ago now. I have price-checked items. Prices are constantly shifting, so I cannot guarantee if you're watching this video a month from now or next league, whether or not it will still remain as inexpensive. But for now, you can get all of the gear in the PoB in the video description below for around 20 exalted orbs. And to prove that the 20 exalt version of the character is effective, I decided to scuff up my own gear. Unfortunately, I did have to take off my calms, which cost me more life than realistically you will lose, but I needed to do that, otherwise I wouldn't have been resist capped, and doing Sirius without resist cap seemed pretty terrible. And then I did a Sirius 8, and I did not make any special attempts to play carefully. I probably should have, as I come very close to death at certain times, mostly due to a false sense of security I'd built up playing my fully geared version and face-tanking the fight. But I didn't die, and I guess this is just a very good demonstration of how resilient and forgiving the build can be. It is very tanky, it has very good recovery. It has multiple layers of reliable defenses, and the damage, while not spectacular compared to, Ball Lightning or even my Penance Brand character, it is more than enough to get the job done. And the character clears very smoothly in maps, due in surprising amount to the way the Aberrath's hooves interact with Tectonic Slam and Fist of War support, which I'll get into later. But I hope you enjoy this build guide. I am primarily focusing it on the end game. I leveled the build with Hollow Palm. Once I got to maps, I put on my gear and I went from there. I think you can do it far more incrementally. It would be a little bit difficult without at least the Paradoxica, as there aren't too many things that are analogous to that weapon. But typically, the types of Paradoxicas used by this build, i.e. those with pen and attack speed, are not in particularly high demand anymore, so that shouldn't be an expensive thing if you're starting the build. If you do want to see me leveling a two-handed slam build in a league start setting, I will put a video in the card and then a second video in the description below of when I did that at the beginning of the league. Now on to my Tectonic Slam Chieftain. This is a build that was originally based off of a character made for hardcore boss killing by a good friend of mine, Mothra Elite. His idea was using strength stacking. It had a couple more defensive layers and around 8.5k health. It was much tankier for sure, but it was going to be slow and awkward to map with, because that really wasn't what it was made for. And while the strength stacking is very good because it lets you double dip defensively, it isn't as good offensively. So a lot of the changes that I made were removing a couple of defensive layers that I felt slowed you down too much, such as Nature's Patience, and swapping out the strength stacking for a Paradoxica. The end result of this is a very forgiving build, clears well enough, it is good at bossing, and it's a good build that I can recommend for beginners to play. Now, some of the unique mechanical interactions here, I am using Blood Magic and Mortal Conviction, along with Supreme Ego, to juice my anger as much as possible. I am real mad for someone who doesn't have any rage. And the reason for this is, again, Paradoxica doubles any flat damage that you have because it causes all attacks to deal double damage. On top of this, the Vengeful Commander notable from Cluster Jewels further increases the potency of my anger, so I'm stacking a bunch of aura effects to get a bunch of flat damage to work with for the build. And if stacking flat damage and aura effect is my main offensive scaling, my main defensive scaling is resistances. I have 1% max res on my Count's Heart, I have 2% max res on my shield, and an additional 3% max cold res on my shield. This shield is quite expensive. It was not too expensive to find a somewhat similar item without the max cold res, however. And if you were feeling truly ambitious, you could probably do something like take a Delve shield, get 3% max chaos, and add Shaper Influence, add Remove Influence to get the 2% all res, to make yourself something superb for use with Divine Flesh. I opted not to get Divine Flesh because that was an additional expense, which was potentially going to push against my 20x budget, and I honestly didn't really feel like I needed it, as nice as a defensive layer as it is, at least for softcore. The other different thing about this build is it uses Abrath's hooves. And at first I thought, oh, that's a nice lazy way to combust. That's pretty cool. What I did not realize is how nice the Ignite Prolith is. When I get a good old Fist of Warslam, it inflicts a significant ignite on the enemy, which is then proliferated as the enemy dies to nearby things. So what this means is I don't have to cover the entire screen with my Tectonic Slam. I can hit part of a pack, and any stragglers simply burn to death as I walk past. On single target, as I'm running around naturally and as I am dodging things, I am able to, again, passively combust, which lowers enemy fire res, and it is certainly noticeable in the damage. Overall, this is a really cool little bonus. The additional support gems in the Abrath's hooves are for its own damage. It's not quite enough that I can just run past everything, but it certainly is helpful in that I can run past a few things and they will just passively die. So if you are used to builds that feel like they play fast, this is going to feel very different. It doesn't move particularly quickly, and it doesn't attack particularly quickly. To the point where the main downside of a build, from my experience, was the fact that I could get attacked as my attack was going off, stunned, and interrupted. Now, normally in most areas of the game, this was not a big deal, because I had enough health that things couldn't stun me. However, when I was delving, this did become a problem, and I ended up swapping the Abraths out for Calm's Roots, just to become permanently immune to stun. And that solved the problem. It's not the best delving build, it's certainly a little too slow in terms of the attack rate. As you get deeper, turbo zones where enemies attack faster are going to become more and more dangerous to the point where they will become undoable. But delving was far outside the scope of this build, i.e. that it's a boss killer adapted to do mapping, and so I'm fine with the fact that it's not great here. How does it perform when mapping? Honestly, not bad. Again, if you want a build that just feels fast, this is not it. But if you want a build that doesn't feel like shit because you're not dying constantly, this is exactly the build for you. It is very reliable, it is very tanky, and it is very forgiving. If you make a mistake, get hit by some enemies, you are going to be totally fine. You're not just going to get blown up. Similarly, it's very forgiving on bosses. It's a good build to learn boss encounters. However, when you boss on it, I highly recommend making sure that you have fully leveled up your dash. That is really a lifesaver for getting out of certain mechanics and positioning, especially on fights such as Cortex. I have done Cortex, I have done Uberelder, I have done Cirrus 8, I have done a tier 16 beachhead, I've done some delving around depth 500, I've done several synthesis maps, and I've done some pure stone bosses, including a 6-man health pure Chiyula, which I did deathless. Overall, the build handled all of these very well, with the exception of delving, where it definitely struggled. However, if you want to see a build that is excellent for delving, and much higher budget, I suggest looking at my Penance Brand build instead. Now, in terms of the rest of the gear, I can't think of specific things that you absolutely need on your amulet or your rings or even your gloves. There's certainly nice things such as gem levels for your anger, that would be either on amulet or gloves, or flat damage on rings, damage mods, potentially a curse on hit, etc. Those are all nice things. They are not absolutely required things. The only other thing that I would say is required and is a little bit of a project is the helmet. Now, I essence crafted mine. It is a pseudo 7-link essence crafted helmet. This did get quite expensive because I was spamming essences at around 30 chaos a piece and then building it out from there. You do not need the essence mod on your helmet. A regular old Conch Effect Immolate helmet is totally fine. It will do plenty of damage, and in fact, that is what I was basically using in the scuffed gear version when I was fighting Cirrus 8. The big importance of using a helmet like this is, 1, fixing crit chance, which is a little bit tricky without the helmet, because there isn't too much access to crit scaling in the tree. It is going for more of a defensive and quality of life setup. And 2, the fact that the Calm's Heart can be corrupted for 1% max res really easily. So Calm's Heart gives life, Calm's Heart gives max res, and the helmet itself fixes crit scaling. Also, again, Immolate is flat damage is more effective, so that works. In terms of a tree, the Watcher's Eye is just a good old dual anger mod, since we can't really use any other auras. The effect of Mortal Conviction is it would cost a lot of life to reserve other auras. The effect of Supreme Ego is they wouldn't do anything anyway, so there's just no point. But the blood magic has the nice upside of not having to worry about mana at all, which again goes into the playstyle of something forgiving and fairly stress-free and something that's a good learning build. Because when your build has a lot of complex mechanics, you can often get absorbed in the mechanics of the build itself, more so than the mechanics of playing Path of Exile and learning the fights. So I wanted to try to simplify this down, even if everything wasn't necessarily optimal, which goes into my war cries, or in this case, war cry. This is a decision that I'm not entirely sure is optimal. I think it's very possible that I could have gone for non-instant war cries and used 2 or 3 war cries and potentially replaced the Paradoxica on my high-end version of a build with a 30-50 Exalt foil and gone with Intimidating Cry, which would add further damage and which would cause all of my attacks, or at least a large number of them, to deal double damage anyway. Now, there's 2 problems with this. One, it adds 30 to 50 Exalts to the price tag and would not be in any way reflected in the more discount version. 2, it adds additional complexity to the build, which will make it harder for people to play. I think I probably could do it, but any time that I make a mistake in my rotation and lose damage, or get hit by a mechanic because I'm focusing on my rotation, is a chance that I could die. I could lose EXP. And so if I'm trying to say this is a good build for learning, I want to minimize that as much as possible. If you do want a more complex rotation of war cries, I would strongly suggest going this route. I would suggest Intimidating Cry so that you can intimidate enemies for 10% increased damage taken. This isn't as big as it might be in other cases because they already take 20% increased damage from being covered in ash. And then for your third war cry, either use Enduring Cry, which will cause you to have an amazing extra life flask on a short cooldown and restore some endurance charges as needed, although I found just for my ascendancy endurance charges were sustaining themselves well enough. Or alternatively, you could go for Infernal Cry to boost the clear. I would sacrifice the support gems in the Abaraths, maybe keeping the Awakened Increased Area of Effect or Increased Area of Effect, depending on which version of a build you're looking at, and obviously you want to drop Call to Arms. You no longer want your war cries to be instant because you don't want them sharing a cooldown. Now, the other reason that I opted not to do this is my bars are rather full, and I've always found it extremely awkward and clunky to switch to the second bar via the control modifier. Part of this might be my control setup, mostly being on the number pad, but part of it also is that PoE does not feel like a game where switching between hotbars is very conducive to smooth gameplay. In something like World of Warcraft, you can simply have an additional hotbar active and visible at all times. And this is fine because there's just something about the out of sight, out of mind thing of it, where I am less likely to remember the cooldown of a thing I can't see, which means I have to put all of my abilities with cooldowns on my main bars. And then there are times where, say, I'll switch to my second bar, hold down control, I'll cast the totem, and then I'll animation cancel the totem, and I'll waste my time, but I've already swapped back to using a skill on my main bar. So I've always found that kind of gameplay to be very awkward. So now that I've talked about some things that could be done differently, I'd like to talk about the successes I've had, because I've had a lot of successes. Not the least of which was that Cirrus, where I played notably sloppily compared to normal. It is very jarring to go from being a full build to being about a half a build. My damage was cut in half and I lost 1,000 life. So things that I was used to tanking and not feeling particularly threatened by were all of a sudden much more dangerous. Yes, these are bad habits. Yes, I should play better. But again, I think it is a good thing to showcase this, which is why I didn't retake the footage, because it shows that you can make mistakes and you're not just going to die for them. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to die. If you get hit by enough things or at the wrong time, you absolutely can, which is why I hit my life flasks when I do, and why I feel I did get lucky at a couple points. In the mapping department, the wide range of Tec Slam, combined with the Fist of War support and the Ignite Prolif from Abaraths, felt really smooth. Sure, I didn't feel like, oh, I'm running at 1,000,000 miles a second and all that, but I also didn't feel like I was slow either. I felt like, okay, I'm gonna walk up to this pack, it's dead, alright, moving on, picking up an item, moving on, picking up an item, moving on. It was a very good, very even pace, and it was honestly quite satisfying to see those huge hits come in from Fist of War and just one-shot Syndicate members, or beasts, or chunk a Metamorph to about half health from full, because I crit on my initial Fist of War, and before going into the Metamorph, I had set it up so that I was on the final exertion of my Seismic Cry, which gives a very large damage bonus. And this is one other thing about Seismic Cry being on left click that I do think bears mentioning, It is very efficient as long as you're attacking consistently. You will lose some damage if you find yourself moving more than you are attacking, in which case you might want to put something like Blood Rage on left click and Seismic Cry on right click, because if you do that, yes, you're going to spam refresh Blood Rage. There's no real downside to that. You can easily regen through it because you leech from fire damage dealt, and you also have about 2.5k life regenerated per second from your Chieftain Ascendancy. You get some from the endurance charges, and you get some from taking fire damage recently, and because you convert physical take into fire, this should be up most of the time when you are getting hit. Personally, I found that I was able to weave in enough attacks that I didn't feel I was losing too much DPS from having Seismic Cry on left click, and it felt really smooth to just have it go off, keep my endurance charges topped, make sure I'm using them smoothly, and all that. But if you want to optimize a little bit more, or you feel you are dodging more and attacking in plays less, face tanking less, which honestly might be a good thing, then definitely try Blood Rage on left click, Seismic on right click. And then finally, what are my experiences with bosses? Are there any bosses that I feel would be problematic? And if so, why? I think all of the Breach Lords, all of the synthesis content, Uber Elder, Cirrus, Shaper, anything found in the normal game is a piece of cake. Kurgal and Ahwatli in the Delve are also quite doable. I did do an Ahwatli at one point. I don't remember that I found any Kurgals to do, unfortunately, but the Delve giveth and the Delve giveth not. The boss that I think would be very problematic on this build is Crystal King, and that is simply because it is very hard, if not impossible, to out-tank him. But again, this is not a build made for delving, so I don't really have a problem with that. Also, Oshabi was not a big deal. I do think there could be a little bit of a struggle on Oshabi, specifically on the section where she rings you in and you have to break out by DPSing down walls. If you are undergeared, this could feel quite awkward and you could potentially fail the encounter because you might not break out in time. Make sure to save flask charges for that. Make sure to set up your Seismic Cry for that. If you do, it shouldn't be too bad. I did not do a Oshabi on the scuffed gear version just because I had already killed her before I made that gear set, and I didn't feel like running an additional 100 maps. So finally, who would I recommend this build to, and who wouldn't I recommend this build to? If you want to go fast, you want to die fast, and you want to just grind a bunch of maps, slam burial chambers or whatever, I don't recommend this build to you. You'll feel like the defenses don't really do anything for you, and you'll probably be annoyed at the lack of extremely high movement speed. Now, if you want to go at a more average speed, or if you just don't use an uber strict loot filter and you aren't full juicing your maps, this build is going to feel very good to play. It is super reliable. It is very strong. If you've never done Cirrus 8 before, this is a great build for you. If you want to get into bossing in general, this is a great build for you. If you want to play something that does not feel so stressful because you don't have 5k life and you don't have to worry about, well, if I don't dodge or evade this, I'm just dead, this is very much a build for you. It is a build made where you can make mistakes, where you don't have to think overly much about your mechanics and your rotation. You have the damage when you need it. You have the on-demand ability to say, I'm going to go kill that one thing. I don't have to worry about my minions not hitting the totem that's making everything else immortal. I'm just going to go smash it with my sword. You have the defenses so that most hits will not chunk you very hard. And overall, the clear is surprisingly good, because even if you don't hit the entire pack, my Ignite Prolif has sometimes cleared 1.5 screens away when I was juicing my maps more heavily. And that's pretty cool. So overall, this is a very good build. I would recommend this build for beginners. I would also recommend it for more advanced players, especially those who value something reliable and strong feeling, because it really has a very visceral and satisfying crunch when hitting enemies. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If this video reaches 10,000 views or 200 likes, I will post a series of the boss battles as their own videos so that you can examine them without random things being thrown up on screen or random editing cutting off portions because I needed to move on and showcase more of another fight. Also, if this video gets 20,000 views or 500 likes, I will make a full written guide and post it on the forums. If you have any thoughts about the build, any questions, or if you try the build, please let me know your experiences in the comments below. Thank you for watching, stay sane, Exiles,